Is Legacy healthy? If it's sick, how do we fix it? As an engaged and involved player, much of the discourse about the health of Legacy frustrates me. I might be terminally online, and before you say anything, yes, I would go and touch grass. But it's winter here in Canada, and I don't like the cold. My name is Matt. Let's talk about Legacy. The way I want to explore the health of Legacy and her discourse is holistically. In mid December 2024, we had a banned and restricted update where Wizards of the Coast banned Vexing Bauble and Psychic Frog. They mentioned that they are also keeping an eye on Nadu, Winged Wisdom, and mentioned that either Entomb or Reanimate were other possible targets. They opted for Psychic Frog instead. Before I delve into my perspectives on both the format and discourse health, I want to define Legacy as objectively as possible. The only current definition that I can find for Legacy is from the Wizards of the Coast Formats Hub page. It's a two-player format where decks are at least 60 cards and no more than 4 copies of any individual non-basic land card can be played. Players may utilize a 15-card sideboard for best of 3 matches. The card pool encompasses all Magic sets, with the exception of a couple cards, well, more than a couple, that have been banned from the format. So that's objective in that these are the rules of the format. The ban list is also objective in that we can concretely define what is and isn't banned. So let's take a look at the full Legacy ban list and sort of categorize the cards for ease of understanding. The full list is objective, but evaluating the cards and the reasons why they were banned is inherently going to include a level of individual perspective and, some of my bias. There are a couple of quick categories that we can knock out though. Cards that include the anti-mechanic, sticker mechanic, attractions, conspiracy, and dexterity-based mechanics, those are all blanket banned. There are also cards that are banned due to being culturally offensive with themes, tropes, or stereotypes that were maybe acceptable at the time they were printed, but certainly are not in the context of today's social norms. The above categories are banned in basically all constructed two-player formats, including modern and vintage. This is a fact, even if you're an edgelord who thinks you should be able to play Invoke Prejudice as an example. If you do think that, go outside and touch grass, even though it is winter, I don't care. I think there are 2.5 to 3 remaining categories, and these are the important cards to consider when we are actually discussing the ban list in Legacy. We have Power 9, old school cards, modern era cards. Those are the 3 sort of big archetypes. The Power 9 are the most powerful and iconic cards in the entire game. They're banned in Legacy due to power level. Of the cards from the 90s, there are many tutors that are banned. Many of them are restricted in Vintage as well. Efficient and unconditional tutors increase deck consistency to a level where much of the variance of Magic is reduced too much. Lots of reusable fast mana effects are also banned. Mishra's Workshop, Soul Ring, and Mana Crypt are great examples of this. The next category are cards that are overwhelming card advantage engines. There is a range of cards here, from Bazaar of Baghdad to Yawgmoth's Bargain, Wheel of Fortune, and Windfall. We get into a class of cards that cheat big things into play: Tinker, Flash, Oath, and Channel. And then we have a couple cards that are simply too much hassle. Goblin Recruiter and Shahrazad are both, I would say, a huge amount of work to actually resolve. The remaining cards from this era are Earthcraft, Frantic Search, Mana Drain, Mind Twist, and Survival of the Fittest. These didn't fit super cleanly into any of the prior categories, and depending on your perspective, I think these are the only cards from that era that we could realistically consider being unbanned. I guess you could also say Necropotence, due to the sort of lack of splash that Necrodominance has made. Of the modern era cards that have been banned, there are 3 categories: card advantage, design mistakes, and cards that are too good with Ancient Tomb or Daze. The banned card advantage cards are Cruise, Dig, and Expressive Iteration. The banned engines are Ren and Six, Skull Clamp, and Underworld Breach. I would say the design mistakes are things like Mental Misstep and Gitaxian Probe, each of which were able to be played in pretty much any deck, and the companions, Luris and Zerda, alongside, of course, the most busted Planeswalker of all time, Oko. And then there are cards that sort of unintentionally change the rules of the game. Arkham's Astrolabe and Vexing Bauble. We have cards that are oppressive when paired with existing iconic legacy cards. So far, most of these have been cheap threats that snowball advantage over time and are simply too good when you pair them with Daze. But this phenomenon can also occur with other iconic legacy cards. White Plume Adventurer is the other big example, where it was oppressive when it was paired with the Soul Lands, Chrome Mox, Lotus Petal type stuff. Sensei's Top and Grief don't fit cleanly into any of these categories. Each created poor gameplay patterns of, spinning top endlessly or double thought seizing your opponent on turn one. I would sort of expect that any future banned cards will be able to be slotted into one of these categories that I've just sort of laid out here. Moving past the existing ban list is where we get into a more subjective area where the quality of discourse matters most. We know what legacy is objectively, I just laid out the rules, but we don't necessarily know what legacy means. Thematically, it's iconic and it's eternal. These are words that WotC has used to describe the format. To me, iconic means that players can play with many of the most famous cards ever printed. Cards like Lightning Bolt, Swords to Plowshares, Force of Will, Dark Ritual, Wasteland, and of course the revised Dual Lands. It has a feeling of weight and of historical significance. Would the format have a dramatically different metagame if we could only play with Shocklands instead of the revised duels? I think it would be more similar than it would be different. I think it would feel dramatically different though. For me, it's cool and exciting to play with an Underground Sea that was printed the same year I was born. Eternal has a definition within this context. It's non-rotating, meaning that no cards will ever be removed from the format unless they are banned. But it also has a vibe. Eternal is everlasting, absolute, forever. Magic is not only of the past, its history is still being written. New cards printed, new sets, new flavor, new design space, new ways to play. So how do we reckon with Legacy being eternal, but also eternally changing? Should we be protecting the old or embracing the new? I think we're looking for big picture outcomes, and we may not always have the words that we want to use for what we want Legacy to look like. But on some level, we all have a vision of what we want. Are the old cards or the new cards more important? I think this is a massive oversimplification, of course, but we can boil down one component of this discussion around Daze to this question. Daze is an iconic card from the year 2000. It counters a spell unless an opponent pays 1 mana. It can either be cast for 2 mana, or you can return an island to hand from play to forego paying the mana cost. It's an effect that essentially trades land development for same turn mana efficiency and tempo. It's most commonly being seen in play in combination with efficient threats played in the first few turns of the game, like Delver of Secrets or historically Nimble Mongoose. Using it in this manner, these decks attempt to keep the opponent off their game plan long enough for these creatures to win the game. The dynamic of tempo decks like Delver or Canadian Threshold is that they are strong against combo decks as they apply pressure while also being able to disrupt the assembly of those combos or the combo itself. These decks tend to struggle against mid-range and control decks where individual card quality is higher and the tempo or board control can be swung back. I touched on it earlier when discussing cards that are banned for being too powerful in combination with Daze. Ragavan, Dreadhorde Arcanist, and Psychic Frog are cards that I think have been banned due to this dynamic. The nature of the tempo development for... Sorry, the nature of the tempo for development trade-off is broken when the tempo threats being played accrue advantage, making it more difficult for the mid-range and control decks to fight for the initiative. The concept of initiative, not the mechanic initiative. The accrual of card advantage means that the tempo decks can continue to make resource disadvantage trades for board control and tempo while maintaining the initiative without ever running out of resources. Without being able to recoup the losses from these poor trades, the tempo decks will inevitably run out of resources and they'll be unable to close out the game. So when the next Psychic Frog or Ragavan is printed and it becomes clear that this is leading to poor outcomes or leading to a tempo deck becoming dominant, In my mind, this is the dynamic that we're seeing at play. So, how does one solve this problem? It's a question of ideal outcomes. I like Days. I also like Ragavan, Dreadhorde Arcanist, and Psychic Frog. Is it more important for Legacy to include new cards from this new design space? Or is it more important for Legacy to include iconic cards like Days? Days and Ragavan, I think, is the biggest example of this, but White Plume Adventurer is another. There will be more cards that, when printed, combine with Soul Lands to push Stompy archetypes over the edge into an oppressive state. We can look at cards like Show and Tell and Reanimate as bigger and flashier creatures like Gristlebrand, Atraxa, and Archon of Cruelty are printed. I think there's going to be a point where Reanimator or Sneak and Show crosses that line. Probably at some point that will happen. I think Underworld Breach is another example of this. When combined with existing Storm Shells, it pushed Lion's Eye Diamond and Brain Freeze over that line. There isn't necessarily a correct answer to this. The question is what you value and how you value it will dictate how you respond. Each of us has individual perspectives on the value of different cards. I can make an argument that too many cards have died for the sins of Days, or I can make an argument that Days is part of the glue that holds the format together. By doing so, by checking combo decks, so should we ban these cards that are too powerful in combination with Days? Or should we ban Days itself? Both arguments are valid, to be honest. They're just an opinion on a card by an individual. I think that we should also look at the fallacy of relying on data. This is ironic as me, Matt, the data guy, but I think that we as a community look at and rely on data too much. If we use data as our only indicator of format health, we potentially miss things that could be problematic later or fail to consider other aspects of what a healthy format is. The recent example of this, Grief and Psychic Frog, were both played in the best deck, Dimir Riskaminator. Psychic Frog had a strong win rate, but it was only really played in Dimir decks and Grixis Delver. Grief had a lower win rate, but was played in a wide array of decks from Oops All Spells to Mono Black Aggro, Helm Combo. WotC decides to ban Grief, based on its inclusion in the best archetype that has spent several months on top of the metagame. Despite the rest of the player base actively trying to get Grief. Not become grief-stricken, of course, but, Psychic Frog, they decided not to ban at the time because it was new and it hadn't hit such a high play rate. But due to the dynamics that I discussed earlier with Days, Psychic Frog becomes the most important threat in the format, and by the time that it's banned months later, it's boasting a very high win rate and a very high play rate. But come on, this was fully predictable. This precedent set by Ragavan and Dreadhorde Arcanist, it was so predictable. Another recent example of this is Vexing Bauble. It had a roughly 50% win rate. Was that ban worthy? I imagine most folks agree with the decision that WotC made to ban it. Data is only one component to consider when we discuss format health and potential bans. It's also critical to understand that we have access to only the smallest sliver of data, so the picture painted could be vastly different than what we would see if we had all the data to look at. What I think is much more important, though, at least to me, is fun. Feelings don't really care about facts. I can't use data to convince you that you're having fun when you're not. I could use data to show you that a deck doesn't win as much as the community thinks it does, but what does that accomplish? I make some people feel stupid that they're not having fun? Data can be presented as fact even though it's frequently not. It's not representative of feelings. Magic is a game, and the feeling of having fun is the most important factor to consider when we're talking about a game. What is fun? This is a topic that we don't see much of in the discourse because it's so blatantly subjective. But I think that we do a great disservice when we don't acknowledge it as one of the most important topics. In fact, I think that much discussion about power level, format health, and gameplay all comes down to the question of fun. It's just disguised as an argument in another form. I think that the piece that is fun is the most important component of this conversation. We should be having fun. Was Grief actually too good? I mean, I could make an argument that Grief was creating more format diversity, allowing many non-blue archetypes to flourish. But does that matter if players weren't having fun? For me, the most personal example of fun being a component of a conversation is from the era of 2015 Miracles with Terminus, Counterbalance, and Sensei's Top. I recall players saying the Terminus should be banned because it punished them for not playing out creatures, or it punished them for playing out creatures, which isn't fun. The top wasn't fun because they hated waiting for their opponent to spin, crack, fetch, spin, crack, fetch, spin. And personally, I remember just wanting Counterbalance banned because I hated that my opponent got to cast their cantrips, but I was locked out of playing mine with no realistic way to remove the counterbalance once it resolved. Is there a right answer to this question? I don't know. In retrospect, banning top managed to sort of resolve all three of these issues, but for me, I still hate it when my Delver opponent brings in counterbalance and resolves it. And to this day, I wish that it had been banned instead. Variety is the spice of life, and so one of the ways that we continue to have fun is through novelty. Included in this question of is this fun is the topic of variety and diversity. It's something that is spoken about and valued by players and wizards alike. Sometimes we are the wizards, you know. Each game of Magic, each format, each deck has new problems to explore and to solve for. This is one of the reasons that a computer can't play Magic, but it's also, I think, why it's so fascinating to us as players. It's the reason that having a dominant deck leads to us having less fun. There's less variety, there are fewer problems to solve. Playing the game then boils down to smaller, less impactful decisions that rob players of agency. Even if the matches are complex and challenging, it removes the aspect of deck building, tuning, and tweaking from the game. We can play chess, but you can't do deck building in chess. I like chess. It's not Magic. Just as we, the players, have big picture perspectives and goals, WotC also has goals for the big picture outcomes. For them, it's based on an entirely different incentive structure. Wizards is owned by Hasbro, a large publicly traded corporation that has a fiduciary responsibility to its shareholders. What this means is that each product needs to generate profit to return to those shareholders, and in the form of dividends, an increase in stock price, or both. I could end this video here. It doesn't matter what we as players want. The machine of the stock market will override everything else, and capitalism is to blame. But I'm not going to do that. As a player base, we fund the continuation of Magic either directly through buying sealed product and digital products like Arena and MTGO, or by supporting our local game stores, which in turn are a key element in the Magic the Gathering ecosystem. Legacy is a smaller and lower spend segment of their customer base, but we do contribute to that economic engine. We have a larger impact on the more collectible end of that spectrum. Our customer side demand for dual lands and reserve list cards drives those prices up, which then creates a sort of aspirational desire for newer players to be able to build up to buying these iconic cards. We are some of the drivers in the luxury and exclusivity of Magic. Because of this important role, WotC has an incentive to maintain the player bases of Legacy and, to a lesser extent, Vintage. They have an incentive to listen to what we, as the player base, want. But based on the most recent banned and restricted updates, I don't really know that they're hearing us. The general reception of the player base that I've seen to the most recent BNR and to the prior few is that Wizards has made the correct decisions, but too slowly and maybe for the wrong reasons. So here's my recommendation. Be vocal about what you want. Use sort of this framework of, what is fun? What do you want out of this game to come to some sort of form of consensus? If we're honest about what we want, we can advocate for that, what we want WotC to do, and why we want them to do it. Lord of the Rings, Marvel, and Modern Horizon sets, they're not going anywhere. They're an effective part of how Hasbro makes their money. While there are players who would like to go back to the good old Legacy before War of the Spark, change is simply part of life. The good old days of Legacy were equally changed by the printings of Jace the Mind Sculptor, Delver of Secrets, Past in Flames, and Stoneforge Mystic, as we are by the Murktide Region's Surveil Lands and Orcish Bowmasters of today. If we don't adapt, and embrace the new, then unfortunately we can bid farewell to the social aspects of this beloved game. Android Netrunner is a really great example of what happens when a community tries to continue without the infrastructure of local game stores and a company creating new products. It might be a great game, beloved by its community, but there are few places where people gather, meet new friends, explore new ideas, and share their love of the game. We can't simply decide to ignore what WotC does, and so we must share our thoughts, feedback, and hope that they hear us. What I would like is for Wizards to lay out some format philosophy for what Legacy is to them. If it's what I want Legacy to be, then hey, I'll be thrilled. But if it's not, that's okay as well. To me, there's really minimal reason that we should have had Psychic Frog and Legacy for 6 months when it was really extremely clear from the moment that it was spoiled that it would cause the exact same problems as Dreadhorde Arcanist and Ragavan did. They have set a precedent that they can be fast and proactive. 1 week before Modern Horizons 3 was released, Gavin Verhey, on behalf of Wizards, published a 2,200 word article on the reasoning for pre-banning Cranial Ram in Pauper because it was too similar to Cranial Plating, a very good and already banned card. I know that Gavin specifically says this doesn't set a precedent, but let's be real. I think it does. The Pauper update article is literally twice as many words as Wizards published regarding Legacy in the entirety of 2024 across 5 mainline BNR updates. I'm not saying that Pauper shouldn't have gotten that attention. The Pauper community deserves that level of effort, but so does Legacy. Wizards has indicated that they're not going to change the update cadence of the banned and restricted updates. So maybe as an alternative, we should have like a monthly check-in on watchlist cards. Frog is preemptively on a watch list, and then every month they check on the data and the player sentiment, and then they can decide if action should be taken. To sort of echo what many other folks with platforms have said, the language that WotC has used with Legacy does not really instill confidence that they're being transparent or that they have a plan. I don't think that we should have a Legacy community board. Look no further than what happened to the Commander panel. The idea that people volunteering their time for a corporation were sent death threats is sickening. It is the role of WotC and Hasbro to manage their public relations and maintain their customer relations as well. We can both enjoy products that Wizards makes and also expect better from them as they continue to make large profits. I understand that Wizards is essentially the only profitable division of Hasbro, but format curation and communication deserves more than 1,100 words over the course of a year. For perspective, this script that is this video is nearly 4 times that length. Those are my thoughts on sort of a macro scale. I want Wizards to articulate and have a plan. Let's look at some individual cards and we'll get into it. As of now, I'm kind of indifferent on the topic of Nadu. I may have a different perspective once some time has passed, but we'll see. I think Daze is an enjoyable skill testing card to play with and play against. I'm usually playing against it though. I am content with the trade-off of banning Ragavan, Dreadhorde, and Psychic Frog in exchange for Daze. My perspective is the same for cards like White Plume Adventurer when compared to the Soul Lands. In this same vein, Tamiyo Inquisitive Student may also be a card that falls into this category of being too good with Daze, but having to spend mana to cash in clues for cards might be enough friction to prevent it from crossing that threshold or that line. I kind of expect that Dimir Tempo Reanimator will remain the best deck in the current format, and that if it reduces diversity and forces other archetypes out of the format, I think Troll of Khazad-dûm is probably the card that I would hit. I think in the same way as Grief did, it functions as the bridge between the fair and unfair strategies. It's not played in the dedicated Reanimator decks like Rakdos, Mono Black, or Tin Fins. I've really been thinking about this for several days, and assuming that we want to keep Entomb and Reanimate in dedicated Reanimator, and that the hybrid functionality part of the deck is the problematic piece, then I think that this is the way that I would attempt to solve it. The question is basically, is the 4 Entomb, 4 Reanimate, and then 2 to 4 copies of Animate Dead and a copy of each of Atraxa and Archon still able to act as a functional game plan? Would other cyclers be able to replace Troll of Khazad-dûm? I'm not sure of this sort of thesis, but I'd love to hear thoughts on it. At time of recording, it's only been a few weeks since the banning of Frog and Bauble, and so far, Dimir Reanimator isn't as prevalent as it was, but there are many possible reasons for this. Anyways, Sowing Mycospawn sucks and I hate it. It feels like the only meaningful way to interact with this card in the entire format is Consign to Memory. I think it's a card that's unlikely that it ever pushes an archetype to being oppressive, but the play pattern of it being an uncounterable tutor for Wasteland and then on 6 mana also exiling a land on cast is miserable to play against. The question of format health and optimization is a deeply complex topic. I generally feel good about my ability to collate information and draw conclusions, but I don't think that format health is something that we can really objectively solve for. Either, like, WotC probably can't do it, and neither can we. Sort of in conclusion of my opinions on the format, I value keeping iconic cards over new cards. I prefer more interaction over less, and while I don't mind Nadu, I'll respect that it may be compromising the experience of others. Tamio may fall into that same family of cards that have proven to be too good with days, but we'll just have to sort of wait and see. The reasons that I would prefer personally to maintain iconic legacy cards are that new cards are basically all in modern. If they break legacy, there's still a place for them. If we ban Ancient Tomb or Daze or Reanimate or Entomb, where can we play these iconic pieces of Magic history? Maybe these iconic cards have homes in Vintage, but I can't afford that. And even if I could, there's nowhere that I could play Vintage outside of Magic Online. Old cards are really cool. I like them. I'm not like tied to them unconditionally. I'm not above changing my mind. If we as a player base collectively decide that we would rather take a different approach to old versus new, I'm still likely going to be a legacy player. Part of that is I have the privilege of being a part of a great legacy community here in Toronto, and that I get to go and play FNM or Magic on Thursday. I can go play Magic Legacy basically any day I want to. The minutia of what is inside of the card game itself is I need it to be fun, but the community in combination with the fun game is what makes Magic worth playing for me. So thank you all so much for watching. I hope that you think about at least the idea of fun being an important part of Magic and how we balance and consider format health. Data doesn't solve everything, but there aren't really any arguments that I see being made that are not ultimately coming down to what is fun. And so I would love for folks to use this as a framework when discussing BNRs.